Reprise de débat, the honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak on the government's motion to extend and expand Canada's mission in Iraq. Liberal Party members do not support this motion to seek Parliament's consent for an unfocused and potentially unending mission because it is not in the Canadian interest. ISIL poses a real and serious threat to security around the world and in Canada. We recognize that. Liberals believe that Canada must be part of the international effort against ISIL. As one of 60 nations participating in the coalition against this ideological extremist and terrorist scourge, Canada must play a constructive role. We must make the best contribution we can, one that serves our national interest. The mission proposed by the Prime Minister does not measure up. It has an unclear legal basis, unclear mission objectives, and an open-ended scope. Overwhelmingly, it fails the national interest test. Mr. Speaker, why else do Liberals oppose the Prime Minister's present motion? Well, let's discuss this. Last fall, Liberals did support the government's plan to send special forces into Iraq to help behind the lines, training, advising, and assisting Iraqi forces. We believe that ISIL will be stopped when local Iraqi forces can fight successfully against the ISIL rampage, can protect local people and their villages, can succeed in capturing and holding lost territory, and can commit to respecting minority rights. And so we want to help them be able to do those things. But Liberals did not support the Prime Minister's October motion to go to war in Iraq because he failed to offer a clear objective for his combat plan. He failed to outline a responsible plan to achieve it. And he failed to make the case that a bombing role was the best contribution Canadians could make. Regrettably, the motion before us has similar deficits. Earlier this week, the Liberal Party leader's speech in the House reminded Parliament of 4 core principles Liberals set out for the combat mission in Iraq, the October combat mission, and they still stand today. The first principle is Canada has a role to play in confronting humanitarian crises in the world. That's an important Canadian value. And over many decades, Mr. Speaker, Canadian governments have generously contributed help, military and non-military alike, in human emergencies abroad. We opened our country's doors to the oppressed. We welcomed refugees to come, to rebuild their lives here. And those refugees have helped build Canada. Refugees from Vietnam, Uganda, Cambodia, Somalia, Nicaragua, from every corner of the world have come to Canada and made our country better. This current motion contains no new ideas, no new funds, no new proposals to help alleviate the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in the region. Deuxième principe.
The second principle is when our government plans a deployment of our men and women in uniform, Canada's mission and role must be clearly defined. The October motion did not respect that principle, and the motion tabled today is equally as unclear with respect to Canada's mission and role. Last October, the Liberals stated they feared the absence of clear objectives and that it was, in fact, hiding the Prime Minister's true intention to engage and commit Canada to a longer, more intense combat mission. The motion presented today validates that fear. The Prime Minister has stated that his objective is to degrade ISIL, whereas the Minister of Defense says that it is to win until it is completely eliminated. Those two mandates are very different. So once again, we have a new motion on a combat mission without announcing any clear objectives, no plan on the time or way in which Canada will withdraw from this multi-party conflict in a highly complex region undermined by profound divisions and hate.
Section A of the motion gives the government exceedingly vague and broad latitude to conduct this war. I quote, "This House continues to support the government's decision to contribute Canadian military assets to the fight against ISIL and terrorists aligned with ISIL, including airstrike capability, with authorization to conduct airstrikes in Iraq and Syria." That's a pretty open-ended permission slip, and both the Defense and Foreign Affairs ministers appear eager to use it. They explicitly compared this new mission to Afghanistan, stating, "We're in this for the longer term." In Afghanistan, the longer term meant a decade, the longest war in Canadian history. When asked who takes over should ISIL be cleared from Syria, the Minister of National Defense told Evan Solomon on Power and Politics, "I don't know how this is going to end." No clear objective is not good enough. Without objectives or clarity or boundaries in the motion, Canada's war on ISIL in Syria could well result in Syrian President Bashar al-Assad consolidating his grip on power. This president oppressed and terrorized his own people. In just 4 years, he bombed, gassed, and killed over 130,000 of his own citizens. The vast majority of them civilians. Almost a quarter of the victims were women and children, enabling Mr. al-Assad is not in Canadians' interest. The third Liberal principle is that the case for deploying our forces must be made openly and transparently based on clear, reliable, and dispassionately presented facts. This government has not been transparent and open on this mission, not with parliamentarians nor with the Canadian people. They refused to provide cost estimates to Canadians until shamed into it by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. They refused to provide critics with briefings until yesterday, while troops were first deployed last September. It is facts, not fantasy, that underpin the moral value of honesty. Honesty, in turn, earns trust. We cannot trust this government, who have been dishonest to Canadians. At every opportunity, ministers promote the myth of stable, increasing funding for defense, the myth of investment in state-of-the-art equipment. The facts: they have been cutting the budget for the last 4 years. They reduced defense share of funding to 1% of GDP, the lowest in 70 years, and failed to replace our rusting military planes, ships, trucks, tanks, and rifles. The defense minister himself was caught in a string of falsehoods, misrepresenting a photo of a religious ceremony to promote his war rhetoric, making false claims about the NDP past record on combat mission votes, concocting false statistics on former Liberal government defense spending, statistics that are on public record. Much more serious is the fact that our military was sent into ground combat operations in Iraq despite the Prime Minister's repeated, explicit assurances that this would not happen. Canadians were assured by government and by the generals that the Special Forces would not accompany troops to the front lines. They would not do what's called close combat advising. They would not engage in combat. But in fact, they did, and they are. In January, we learned that since last November, the mission had evolved. Canadian troops are active on the front lines. They regularly engage in direct combat activities. Unlike our closest allies whose advisors stay behind the wire, we are needlessly risking our soldiers' lives. Tragically, Sergeant Andrew Joseph Dwyer lost his life in this combat zone. Now this government gives false reasons for participating in the Syria bombing mission. They claim Canada has been asked because only Canada has precision-guided smart bombs to assist the United States. False. Even Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have these munitions and use them very effectively in Iraq, in the region, according to the chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey. Voting yes now to a longer, deeper war for Canada, led by a dishonest government we cannot trust, is simply not in Canadians' interests. Our final principle is that Canada's role must reflect the broad scope of Canadian capabilities, so we help how best we can. Given the Conservatives' massive defence cuts, the Liberals are concerned about asking our Canadian Armed Forces to do more. The Conference of Defence Industries Association Institute reported the force's current, in quote, international deployments mask a considerable decline in capabilities and readiness, end quote. Today's soldiers injured in the Afghanistan war are still waiting to receive timely professional mental health care. How unacceptable. So what are Canada's capabilities? How can Canada play a constructive role in this very challenged region? What roles reflect Canadian values and our national interest? And what do Liberals support? Mr. Speaker, Canada can do better. Canada can act on the values it was known for throughout the world. Values like working constructively with others, helping the less fortunate, doing more than our fair share, being honest. So I'll talk about 3 areas that Liberals support. First, Canada can work constructively with coalition allies to accelerate the training and capabilities of more Iraqi soldiers. According to Major General Michael Hood, 69 Special Forces members currently work with Americans to provide strategic and tactical advice to security forces in the Iraqi army. To date, they have conducted 42 training courses with 650 Peshmerga soldiers. Canada has a clear expertise in helping train Iraqi forces to fight and stop ISIL. Surely there is a need for more trainers. Canada supplied over 1,000 fine trainers in our final years in Afghanistan. Surely Canada can do more now in Iraq, and we can and must do it away from the front lines. And this, Mr. Speaker, is an area in which we differ from our NDP colleagues who have been all over the map about military mission, sometimes talking about potentially being supportive of strategic airlift or military use to bring supplies. Today we heard they're not interested in any military involvement at all, while we, the Liberals, have respect for our Canadian Armed Force members, and we know that they can play an essential role here. Deuxièmement,
secondly, Canada can lead an international humanitarian aid intervention that is well funded and well planned to help those who are suffering in the Levant region. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, has indicated that 3.8 million Syrians are now listed as refugees, while 12 million people who have been displaced need help in Syria. And that's without counting the millions of others who have been displaced and the millions of Iraqi refugees. Last month, the High Commissioner called for an additional $3.7 billion Canadian in humanitarian aid just for 2015. High Commissioner Guterres has indicated that humanitarian needs in Syria are going up much more quickly than our contributions from the international community. He has called on donors to considerably increase aid to refugees and support for local communities that are taking in refugees. This refugee crisis is threatening the stability and the security of the region. Neighboring countries, such as Jordan, have been destabilized, and Turkey is feeding millions of refugees.
Do more to help vulnerable refugee families because it is a Canadian value, and so these families' soldiers can confidently fight ISIL. And third, Canada should expand our country's target for Syrian refugee settlement. Let us give more victims of war an opportunity to start a new life in Canada. This government's promises have been weak and their delivery even weaker. Here's an example of past Canadian government's generosity. In just 1979 and 1980, 50,000 Vietnamese refugees settled in Canada. These immigrants, known as boat people, were both urban and rural dwellers. They did not speak English or French by and large. They had no Canadian relatives, and they arrived during an economic downturn in Canada. This made integrating into Canada and achieving economic independence a difficult struggle. Today, these Vietnamese Canadians are recognized for their successes, their strong communities, and their tremendous contributions to Canada. So keep that figure in mind, Mr. Speaker, 50,000 over 2 years. In contrast, this Conservative government has been miserly in its treatment of Syrian refugees, originally targeting only 1,300 refugees over 18 months. This government resettled less than half by their target date of last December. At opposition members' urging, this government recently increased its pledge to 10,000 refugees in 3 years. But refugee aid groups are skeptical of this pledge because much of the funding must be raised by sponsoring families and private organizations and not provided by government. It is not a Canadian value to do less than our share fare. Canadians believe in helping more, and that's in the Canadian interest. Finally, Mr. Speaker, of the 4 commitments in this government motion, we enthusiastically endorse only the last. And I will quote, that this House offers its resolute and wholehearted support to the brave men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who stand on guard for all of us. Au Parti libéral.
In the Liberal Party, we respect and recognize the professionalism, courage, and devotion of all those who serve our country. We have never hesitated to deploy our Canadian Armed Forces, who are very competent, into combat zones when that was clearly in the national interest of Canada and Canadians. In each case, that national interest was clearly expressed.
Action designed to uphold Canada's interests must have transparent objectives and a responsible plan to achieve them and a plan to exit the theater of war. That is missing from this motion and from this proposed combat mission. So Liberals encourage this government as quickly and as responsibly as possible to shift Canada's role in Iraq. Shift it not into a bombing role in Syria, but back to a non-combat mission focused on expanded Iraqi troop training, humanitarian aid leadership, and a far more generous and warm-hearted welcome to this war's refugees. That's the Canadian way, Mr. Speaker.